January 27, 1991. Tampa Stadium, Florida. 73,000 people packed into one of America's most iconic venues for Super Bowl 25. But this wasn't just another championship game. 10 days earlier, the United States had launched Operation Desert Storm, and America was at war. Security was at its highest level in Super Bowl history. Military helicopters circled overhead. Bomb-sniffing dogs patrolled every entrance. FBI agents were positioned throughout the stadium. And then, just 2 hours before kickoff, a credible bomb threat was reported. 73,000 lives were suddenly in danger, and the entire event was on the verge of cancellation. In the middle of this chaos stood Whitney Houston, scheduled to perform the national anthem in what would become the most iconic rendition in American history. But what nobody knew was that Whitney was facing a choice that would test everything she believed about courage, duty, and the power of music. The decision she made in those terrifying moments didn't just save the Super Bowl. It gave America something it desperately needed during one of its darkest hours. If you want to discover the untold story of the performance that united a nation and proved that sometimes art is more powerful than fear, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story will show you what true bravery looks like under unimaginable pressure. Whitney Houston sat in her hotel room at the Tampa Marriott, staring at the sheet music for the Star-Spangled Banner. She had been preparing for this performance for 3 months, working with musical director Ricky Minor to create an arrangement that would honor the anthem while showcasing her extraordinary vocal range. This wasn't just another performance for Whitney. The national anthem at the Super Bowl was the pinnacle of American musical achievement. Over 100 million people would be watching on television. Every note would be scrutinized. Every phrase would be analyzed. One mistake would be replayed forever. Whitney understood the weight of this moment better than most people realized. She had grown up in Newark, New Jersey, singing in the New Hope Baptist Church where her mother, Sissy Houston, was the musical director. Sissy had taught Whitney that singing wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about respecting the song, honoring the moment, and connecting with something larger than yourself. The national anthem represented everything Sissy had taught her daughter about the sacred responsibility of using your voice. But there was another layer of pressure that Whitney rarely discussed publicly. As one of the few Black women ever invited to sing the national anthem at the Super Bowl, she knew that her performance would be viewed through the lens of race. She would be representing not just herself, not just her family, but an entire community of Black artists who had fought for decades to be recognized in mainstream American culture. Ricky Minor, who had worked with Whitney for years, understood the complexity of what she was facing. Whitney felt the weight of history on her shoulders, he later recalled in interviews. She knew that if she succeeded, it would open doors for other Black artists. But if she failed, it would reinforce stereotypes that she had been fighting against her entire career. The arrangement they had created was unconventional. Instead of the traditional march tempo that most performers used, Whitney and Ricky had slowed it down, transforming the anthem into a soulful, gospel-infused interpretation. It was risky. Some critics might see it as disrespectful to tradition. But Whitney believed that the best way to honor the anthem was to sing it with genuine emotion, not just technical precision. That evening, as Whitney rehearsed one final time in the empty Tampa Stadium, something profound happened. As her voice echoed through the massive venue, carrying the words, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?" she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about giving America a moment of unity during a time of fear and division. What Whitney didn't know was that within hours, that sense of purpose would be tested in ways she never imagined. Whitney woke up at 6 in the morning, 3 hours before her planned arrival at Tampa Stadium. She had barely slept, not from nervousness about the performance, but from the weight of what was happening in the world. For 10 days, America had been at war in the Persian Gulf. Every news channel showed footage of bombs falling on Baghdad. Families across the country were terrified for their loved ones deployed in combat. The nation was raw with fear, anger, and uncertainty. Whitney turned on CNN and saw images of soldiers preparing for ground combat. Many of them were young men and women barely out of high school. Some of them would be watching the Super Bowl from military bases halfway around the world. Others would be in combat zones, unable to watch but hearing about it later through letters and phone calls. I realized that morning that my performance wasn't just entertainment. Whitney later told Diane Sawyer in a rare interview about that day. Those soldiers needed to know that America supported them. Families needed to feel connected to something larger than their fear. I had to get this right. Not for my career, but for them. Whitney's mother, Sissy, called at 7:30 that morning. She had been praying all night and wanted to remind her daughter of something important. "Baby," she said, her voice steady and strong, "you were born for this moment. Don't sing for the cameras. Don't sing for the critics. Sing for that soldier who's scared. Sing for that mother who's crying. Sing for America." Those words would sustain Whitney through what was about to unfold. At 9:45 a.m., exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes before kickoff, FBI Special Agent Michael Torres received a phone call that would change everything. The call came through a tip line that had been established specifically for Super Bowl security. The voice on the other end was male, calm, and disturbingly specific. "There is a device in Tampa Stadium," the caller said. "It will detonate during the national anthem. 73,000 people will die unless the game is canceled." Agent Torres had been with the FBI for 15 years and had investigated countless bomb threats. Most were hoaxes from people seeking attention or trying to disrupt major events. But there were specific details in this call that immediately elevated it to a credible threat. The caller knew the exact seating capacity of the stadium. He knew that the national anthem was scheduled for 12:15 p.m. And most disturbing, he knew details about the stadium's infrastructure that weren't public knowledge. Within minutes, the FBI's bomb data center in Washington, D.C., was analyzing the threat. The decision about whether to evacuate the stadium fell to a small group of people, including Agent Torres, NFL officials, and local law enforcement. The conversation that followed was one of the most intense in Super Bowl history. "If we evacuate and it's a hoax, we've let terrorists win by disrupting American life," argued NFL Security Director Warren Welsh. "But if we don't evacuate and the threat is real," one NFL official said quietly, "we're responsible for the largest mass casualty event in American history." Agent Torres made the call that would define his career. "We sweep the stadium. Every inch. We double all security checkpoints. We position SWAT teams at every entrance. But we don't evacuate. We don't cancel. Because if we do, we're telling America that fear wins." The decision was made. The Super Bowl would continue. But nobody was going to tell the performers, the players, or the 73,000 fans about the bomb threat. The reasoning was simple. If there was mass panic, the evacuation itself could be more dangerous than the threat. But that decision meant that Whitney Houston would walk onto the field with no idea that FBI agents believed a bomb might detonate during her performance. Whitney arrived at Tampa Stadium at 10:30 a.m., 90 minutes before her scheduled performance. The moment she stepped out of her limousine, she knew something was wrong. The security presence was overwhelming. Military personnel in full combat gear were positioned at every entrance. German shepherds were moving through the parking lots. Helicopters circled so low overhead that she could feel the vibration in her chest. Ricky Minor met her at the entrance, his face tense. "Something's happening," he said quietly. "Nobody's telling us what, but security just went through our equipment 3 times. They even x-rayed my piano." Whitney felt her stomach tighten. "Is there a threat?" Ricky shook his head. "They won't say. But look around. This isn't normal Super Bowl security." As Whitney was escorted to her dressing room, she passed FBI agents speaking urgently into radios. She saw bomb-sniffing dogs being led through corridors. She watched as SWAT team members took positions on the stadium's upper levels. Whatever was happening, it was serious. In her dressing room, Whitney tried to focus on her vocal warm-ups, but her mind was racing. She thought about her daughter, Bobby Christina, who was back in New Jersey with family. She thought about her mother's words that morning. She thought about the soldiers watching from halfway around the world. And she thought about the 73,000 people who were beginning to fill the stadium, completely unaware that they might be in danger. At 11:45 a.m., exactly 30 minutes before her performance, there was a knock on Whitney's dressing room door. It was Agent Torres. "Ms. Houston," he said, his voice professional but kind, "I need to speak with you privately." Agent Torres closed the door and looked directly into Whitney's eyes. What he said next would give her the most difficult decision of her life. "Ms. Houston, There's been a credible bomb threat targeting the stadium during the national anthem. We've swept the entire venue and found nothing, but I can't guarantee your safety. You have the right to refuse to perform. We'll understand completely, and we'll find an alternative." Whitney felt the room spin. A bomb threat. During her performance. 73,000 people potentially in danger. Every instinct told her to walk away, to protect herself, to let someone else handle this impossible situation. "Do the fans know?" Whitney asked. Agent Torres shook his head. "We made the decision not to create panic. If we evacuate, the threat wins. But if you're uncomfortable, we can play a recorded version of the anthem, and no one will know." Whitney was silent for a long moment. Through the walls of her dressing room, she could hear the crowd beginning to fill the stadium. She could hear children laughing, families talking, the excitement of people who had come together to watch a football game and forget about the war for a few hours. Ricky Minor, who had been listening to the conversation, put his hand on Whitney's shoulder. "No one would blame you if you walked away," he said gently. "This is bigger than music." But Whitney was thinking about something her mother had told her years ago. "When God gives you a gift," Sissy had said, "it's not really yours. It's on loan, and you have a responsibility to use it when people need it most." "These people need something right now," Whitney said finally, her voice steady despite her fear. "They need to feel safe. They need to feel united. If I walk away, the fear wins. If I walk away, I'm telling them that terrorism works." Agent Torres studied her face. "You understand the risk?" Whitney nodded. "I understand. But I also understand that sometimes you have to do what's right even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared." The decision was made. Whitney Houston would perform the national anthem live, knowing that somewhere in that stadium there might be a bomb programmed to detonate during her song. As Whitney prepared to walk through the tunnel onto the field, Ricky Minor made a decision that would become one of the most controversial aspects of that day's performance. He had been recording Whitney's rehearsal performances as backup, standard practice for major televised events. Now, with the bomb threat creating additional pressure, he made a choice that he believed would protect Whitney's legacy if something went wrong. "We're going to use a backing track," he told the sound engineers. "If there's an explosion, if there's chaos, at least America will hear the performance as it was meant to be heard." This decision would later spark debates about whether Whitney sang live or lip-synced. The truth was more complex. Whitney would sing live, but her voice would be blended with a pre-recorded track as a safety measure. It was a compromise between authenticity and security, between art and survival. As Whitney stood in the tunnel, waiting for her cue, she closed her eyes and prayed. It wasn't a prayer for success or for a perfect performance. It was a prayer for peace, for the soldiers fighting overseas, for the families watching at home, and for the 73,000 people who were about to trust her to give them a moment of unity. Whitney Houston then walked onto the field at Tampa Stadium, and 73,000 people rose to their feet, completely unaware that they were watching one of the bravest performances in American history. The roar of the crowd was deafening as Whitney emerged from the tunnel. She was wearing a white tracksuit with red and blue accents, designed to echo the American flag without being costume-like. Her hair was pulled back, her expression focused and determined. This wasn't the glamorous Whitney Houston of the music videos and award shows. This was a woman on a mission. As she took her position at the center of the field, surrounded by a color guard holding massive American flags, Whitney locked eyes with Agent Torres, who was positioned near the tunnel. He gave her a subtle nod. They had done everything possible to secure the stadium. Now it was in God's hands and Whitney's voice. The crowd quieted. The moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. Whitney took a deep breath, and then she began to sing. "Oh, say can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming." From the very first note, everyone in that stadium knew they were experiencing something extraordinary. Whitney's voice was powerful but not aggressive, emotional but not sentimental. She sang with a purity and passion that transcended technical perfection. This was a woman singing for something bigger than herself. As she moved through the verses, something remarkable began to happen throughout the stadium. People stopped thinking about the war. They stopped thinking about their fears. They stopped thinking about anything except the moment they were experiencing together. Whitney's voice seemed to wrap around every person in that venue, creating a collective experience of hope and unity, whose broad stripes and bright stars, through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched, were so gallantly streaming. FBI agents positioned throughout the stadium were supposed to be scanning for threats, but even they found themselves caught up in the performance. Agent Torres later admitted that he forgot about the bomb threat for nearly 30 seconds, lost in the power of what he was hearing. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Whitney held that note, that impossibly long, impossibly beautiful note, and 73,000 people held their breath with her. This was the moment. If the bomb threat was real, if something was going to happen, it would be now, during the most powerful moment of the performance. But nothing happened.
No explosión. No chaos.
Just Whitney's voice, soaring above the stadium, declaring that despite the bombs, despite the fear, despite everything, the flag was still there. America was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. As Whitney sang the final words, her voice reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the foundation of the stadium. And then, as the last note faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. For 3 seconds that felt like eternity, 73,000 people were completely still, processing what they had just experienced. Then the stadium exploded with sound. Not a bomb, but something more powerful.
Pure un filter de joy.
People were crying, hugging strangers, waving flags. Grown men had tears streaming down their faces. Military personnel saluted with shaking hands. Agent Torres, standing in the tunnel, felt his own eyes filling with tears as he spoke into his radio. Anthem complete. No incident. All clear. As Whitney walked off the field, her legs were shaking so badly that Ricky Minor had to study her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was wearing off, and the reality of what she had just done was hitting her with full force. "I can't believe that just happened," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the performance. "Did we really just do that?" Back in her dressing room, Whitney collapsed onto a couch, emotionally and physically exhausted. But there was no time to rest. NFL officials, FBI agents, and military representatives were lining up to thank her. What they didn't tell her immediately was that her performance had been broadcast live to American military bases around the world. Thousands of soldiers serving in Operation Desert Storm had watched her sing, and according to military communications officers, morale had skyrocketed in the hours following the broadcast. General Norman Schwarzkopf, commander of coalition forces in the Gulf War, would later say that Whitney Houston's national anthem did more for troop morale than any speech or propaganda campaign could have achieved. "She reminded our soldiers what they were fighting for," he stated in a press conference weeks later. She reminded them that America was united behind them. But the most profound impact was happening in living rooms across America. Families who had been terrified for their loved ones overseas found themselves experiencing a moment of collective pride and hope. The performance was being replayed on every news channel, and each time it aired, the emotional response grew stronger. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, as Whitney was finally able to leave Tampa Stadium, she received a phone call from President George H.W. Bush. "Whitney," the president said, his voice thick with emotion, "you gave America exactly what we needed today. You reminded us that we're stronger than our fears. Thank you." But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. At 5 p.m., Whitney received a stack of messages that had been routed through NFL offices. They were from soldiers stationed in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other Gulf War locations. The messages were handwritten on military stationery, brief but powerful. One, from a Marine named James Rodriguez, simply read, "We heard you sing. We're not afraid anymore. Thank you for reminding us why we're here." Another, from an Army nurse named Patricia Williams, wrote, "I've been taking care of wounded soldiers for 10 days. We played your anthem in the hospital tent. Some of these men will never walk again, but when they heard you sing, they smiled. You gave them something I couldn't hope." Whitney Houston had performed many times in her career. She had won Grammys, sold millions of records, and captivated audiences around the world. But that day at Tampa Stadium, she had done something that transcended entertainment. She had given a nation at war a moment of unity, hope, and strength. In the days following the Super Bowl, Whitney's performance became a national sensation. Arista Records, her label, released it as a single, with all proceeds going to the American Red Cross Gulf Crisis Fund. It shot to number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100, remarkable for a song written in 1814. But then the controversy erupted. Music critics and industry insiders began questioning whether Whitney had actually sung live or lip-synced to a pre-recorded track. The debate became so intense that it threatened to overshadow the emotional impact of the performance. Ricky Minor, who had made the decision to blend Whitney's live vocals with a backing track, felt compelled to defend their choice. "We were dealing with an unprecedented security situation," he explained in interviews. Using a backing track wasn't about deception. It was about ensuring that if something catastrophic happened, America would still hear this performance. Whitney herself was hurt by the accusations. For weeks, she refused to address the controversy publicly, believing that the argument about technical details missed the entire point of what had happened that day. But finally, during a press conference in March 1991, she addressed the issue directly. "I sang live that day," Whitney stated firmly. "Yes, there was a backing track for technical reasons I couldn't discuss at the time. But every note you heard was my voice. In that moment, for those people under circumstances I hope no performer ever has to face again." What Whitney couldn't reveal at the time was the bomb threat, the fear, the impossible choice she had been given. The full story wouldn't emerge until years later, when FBI documents were declassified and Agent Torres spoke publicly about the security situation. When people finally learned about the bomb threat, the conversation shifted dramatically. Whitney's performance was reframed not as a technical question about live versus recorded singing, but as an act of extraordinary courage. She had chosen to walk onto that field knowing there might be a bomb. She had chosen to give 73,000 people a moment of joy and unity despite the risk to her own life. "That's not just artistry," Agent Torres said in a 2001 interview marking the 10th anniversary of the performance. "That's heroism." The true legacy of Whitney Houston's Super Bowl performance wouldn't be fully understood until 10 years later, on another day that tested America's spirit. When terrorists attacked the World Trade Center and Pentagon on September 11, 2001, the nation was plunged into fear and trauma. In the days following the attacks, as America struggled to process the horror and find sources of comfort and strength, something extraordinary happened. Radio stations across the country began playing Whitney Houston's version of the Star-Spangled Banner. Television networks aired footage of her 1991 Super Bowl performance. And once again, her voice became a source of national unity and healing. Arista Records re-released the single, and this time it reached number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100, the highest chart position ever for a rendition of the national anthem. All proceeds, over $2 million, were donated to firefighters and police officers' funds. Whitney herself was deeply moved by the resurgence of the performance. "I recorded that song 10 years ago under circumstances I could barely understand at the time," she said in a September 2001 interview. "Now, watching it bring comfort to people during another national tragedy, I finally understand why I was meant to sing it that day. I wasn't just singing for 1991. I was singing for every moment when Americans would need to remember who we are and what we stand for." The performance became more than a musical moment. It became a cultural touchstone, a reminder of American resilience during dark times. In 2002, it was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, and in 2020, it was added to the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry as culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. But for those who were there that day in Tampa Stadium, for the 73,000 people who experienced it live, the performance had always been more than just a song. It was a moment when fear was transformed into hope, when division was overcome by unity, and when one woman's courage reminded an entire nation what it meant to be brave. In the years following her iconic Super Bowl performance, Whitney Houston faced addiction, troubled relationships, and the crushing weight of fame. Her struggles often overshadowed her achievements, but those who knew her best remembered the woman who stood on that field in Tampa, choosing courage over fear. Ricky Minor, her longtime collaborator, once said, "Whitney understood something many artists never do. Your gift isn't really yours. It belongs to the people who need it." That day, America needed Whitney Houston more than she needed to protect herself, and she showed up. Her mother, Cissy Houston, kept a photograph from that moment on her mantle. Whitney's face lifted to the sky, surrendering completely to the song. "This is who my daughter really was," she'd tell visitors. Not the headlines. This, a woman who gave everything, even when she was afraid. When Whitney died in 2012, tributes poured in from around the world. Among the most moving were letters from Gulf War veterans who had heard her anthem from hospital beds, desert camps, and aircraft carriers. One of them, Michael Thompson, attended her funeral, saying through tears, "I was 19, terrified in that desert. Then I heard Whitney sing. Her voice reminded me I was part of something bigger than my fear. I made it home because of many reasons, but her voice is one of them." More than 3 decades later, Whitney's rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner remains the gold standard. Played at military ceremonies and memorials, it has transcended its moment to become part of American heritage, a symbol of unity, hope, and courage. The bomb threat that day was never solved. Some believe it was a hoax. Others think it was real but removed. Agent Torres, one of the investigators, offered another view. Maybe there was no bomb. Maybe the real threat was fear itself, and maybe Whitney's voice was the weapon we needed. Whether or not there was danger in Tampa that day, her choice to sing despite it created a performance that still comforts millions. It reminds us that the greatest power against fear is not force, but art, a voice lifted in defiance and hope. On January 27, 1991, Whitney Houston gave America that gift. And each time her anthem plays, each time someone finds strength in those notes, her courage endures. The Star-Spangled Banner yet waves, not only because of soldiers and leaders, but because of artists like Whitney Houston, who remind us that courage can live in a song.